Good evening. Okay, we had already talked about, or have already talked about, basic components like notes and tones, scales, harmonies, chords, key signatures, rhythm, or the components and the building blocks of rhythm. And we had talked about most of that stuff previously. I went back onto the videos that there were some videos, two videos. There was Music Theory 11, Basic Components 10, Music Notation 1, and then the next video was Notation 2. And we had talked about a whole lot of concepts that were happening in the actual composition software. I wanted to cover the basics of it. And we covered most things that you're going to run into when you are dealing with it, dealing with music from the compositional point of view on the staff. And so basically in this video, we're just going to take some time, one step at a time. We're going to go through this notation software and look at some of the things on it that are going to be other tools for you to work with your music. A lot of tools can be, there can be a lot of tools that are very instrument specific, as far as what type of an accent is something is, or something like some type of an accent or some type of articulation or something like that. And you would basically have to get very familiar with all the instruments that there are, for different articulations. We're not going to go into that. We're just not. We're probably going to cover some basics in the notation software, but we're just not going there. There's a lot of different instruments, and at this point, maybe later on this channel, we'll get into a whole bunch of different instruments, depending on how long the channel goes and what we get into. But the first part of this channel, it's basically about music theory. So we started out with basic theory, and we went and got into some more advanced theory concepts. And then we kind of laid it out in layman's terms, and then we got back into the notation software, or onto the staff and the compositional tools to be able to use that for another tool. So at this point, we're just going to go one step at a time and take a look at the notation software and some of the other things that we've already talked about that we're just going to address again before we go into some other areas in theory. That way that hopefully by the time, you might have to watch all the videos on this channel a couple times, maybe 3 times, to really get a good understanding of all the concepts we've talked about. And you may run into some other that I kind of brushed upon but didn't get really in depth on it, because I really tried not to address this as you're going to be Beethoven, or you're going to be some super composer for some philharmonic orchestra that you might be. And when you start going in that direction, and you're going to be that kind of virtuoso, that you're going to have some more studies, bro. I mean, I'm trying to cover most of the basics, but that it can get more and more complex, and I'm trying to cover most of the basics so that those concepts you're enlightened to them. And as you go along, you'll run into things you're trying to do that you may have to investigate a little bit. Or you can ask me on the channel. You can say, "Hey, Doc, what's going on with this? I mean, I don't know what the heck that is." And I'll try to answer as best I can. So let's just kind of go through the software. This is Sibelius. And if you've downloaded the free MuseScore, or you've chosen some other software, most of the things are going to be available. But we're going to try to cover the basics. We may go back and cover some of the things. Some of the things the software does is just really cool, that are just really cool tools to help you with a workflow in composition, and working with other compositions, and and just working out your theory or the composition or whatever you might be doing in it, to really have a very rapid workflow and a very functional workflow that does a lot of cool things very rapidly. So we might touch on some of those, but that's not really the purpose of this series, was to talk about music theory. We may get into the software some later for dealing with theory, like we've talked about musician. We're talking about software here for composition, like Sibelius or MuseScore, or there's lots of them. There's lots of tools for doing that. So let's just take a look at some of the other basic components, and most we've already talked about, but let's just kind of go through a few of them again. Alright, let's take a look at some basic ones. The first basic ones we want to look at is we'll look at like this one here. This is the accent. And basically that's pretty obvious. That if you see that sign, it's telling you to accent that note. More than likely play a little bit louder than the notes around it. This is a staccato note, which you can see from sitting where it's at. It's not probably going to get confused with the rhythm dot that we've talked about. That's going to make the note very sharp and crisp. Click, you know, like that. Most of the time, that's what staccato is referencing. But like I said in previous, you know, that's the main idea of this. It's a kind of a staccato thing. And there's staccatoissimo and you know, there's different ways to view that and different ways to articulate that. But that's the basic concept of it. And this right here is the tenuto, and basically that's trying to tell you to hold that for the note's length, the given length, or slightly more. Normally is the use of it, normally slightly more than the value of the note, which it can end up causing some issues depending on where it's being used. If there's another note after it, that's kind of hard to do. You know, so the actual feeling of that can maybe where it's coming to a rest or something like that. But that again can be very much, that's the basic concept, but exactly how it might be articulated may be different depending on what you want. If you can listen to the work or who's notating it, may see that a little bit differently. Here we have, over here, we're looking over here, we've talked about all these on here. And when we come over to here, the first one we're looking at is appoggiatura. Now this right here is it's like a grace note. Basically, you're going to hit this note before this note, but it's going to kind of like fall into it, you know, and it's going to land on this note being in time, but it's just going to be kind of rapidly before it. This right here is this right here, and it's basically the same thing. Depending on how it's looked at, that this note is accented before it hits this one rapidly, or this one gets accented. So it's kind of like a grace note may have the same force and volume dynamic level as the note it's coming to, whereas this one would be softer coming into this one at normal level. So those are two things that two ways you can look at it, and that can be very debatable depending on who's notating it and who's taught them to read notation. Another thing, you have like a slide. That's very simple, that you're able to see that it's sliding. That's an articulation to slide from one note to another as best you can with whatever instrument you're working on. And then you have this here, and before we go on to that, we've talked about these rhythm dots. Here's a triple dot, there's a double dot that can also be used. And we come into here, now we're talking about tremolos, and depending on how many you have, this is going to be 4 tremolos on this one, and it could be up to 16 or 32 tremolos. So that can be very simple concept. You understand a tremolo? It's like da 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 da, and that's the basic concept. It's very simple to understand and very simple to articulate and very simple to notate. This right here is basically a pause. They call it a fermata, and it basically is a pause. You have a short fermata here and a long fermata here for pauses. And the understanding of that is that can be very debatable also, because basically you have a rest here and a pause on top of it can be, sometimes it can be very easy to understand, and sometimes you can be looking at a piece of notation or looking at some kind of score and seeing that in place of a rest, you know, and it's like, well, it wants you to pause, or it's there to cause the whole symphony to pause for a moment, and then you're going to continue when the conductor starts you again. And that can be very simple. Some of these signs in this are custom articulations. You have some other ones. Let's see. Let's look at some here. We have the first one I want to look at is arpeggio. this can be very confusing sometimes, because sometimes an arpeggio will be like this. It'll be shaped like a chord, and it's expecting you, like on a guitar, not to play it da, but to play it da 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 da, but quickly sweep the strings. That they're not all strummed at the same time like a strum, but it's kind of like da, something like that. And that also can be to where you have an arpeggio, like a major arpeggio that's going to go root third fifth, root third fifth, root third fifth, going up or going down. That they're notes in succession, not stacked like a chord. They're actually going to be, it'll look more like a melody line, but it's actually an arpeggio. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at and looking how they're writing it, what they're expecting you to do. But that's either going to tell you that it's going to want you to play the chord like that, or it's telling you that there's an arpeggio there. So those are two things that you kind of want to get familiar with. And these are, if you look at these here, these are repeat bars. So if you see this, this basically is to repeat the last bar. If you see this, it's to repeat the last two bars back from the first. If this is, like if this one is here, you're going to want to repeat these last two bars from here to here, and then move forward from here. Does that make sense? However many of those there are. And those are very simple concepts. The other concepts that we didn't talk about are going to be things like this, double sharp. You can see over here on the side that that's a double sharp mark, and that's a double flat mark. These I wouldn't worry about too much, a quarter sharp and a quarter flat. Some of these other markings are very specific to certain types of articulations you may be doing with certain types of instruments and certain types of flow through it. And as you get more familiar with your instrument, some of those things are going to be pertinent to you, some of them won't. And that really is going to depend on what kind of instrument you're working on. Like on a piano, you're not, unless you have yourself a pitch bend bar or a modulation thing on your keyboard that, playing the piano, you're not going to bend that key anywhere, shape, or form. So you're not going to have much use for that. So that's pretty simple. And those are some of the first basic ones that are very obvious, and they're notated here and used here a lot because they're used a lot. Those things like this is a double whole note, a breve. So instead of one whole note that it would be one measure, that's going to be a double whole note, a breve, which is going to be like two measures. And we talked about the rhythmic timing and the values of notes that can be used in your subdivision and your multiplication when you're figuring out different time signatures, and that can be very helpful sometimes. But those are the basic ones you really want to worry about. Most of any of this other stuff you see is, a lot of it can be for looks. Some don't, like this right here. This is a joint. Now that is going to be very specific, instrument specific, and that we're not going to get into that unless when you start looking at a certain instrument that you'll get yourself more familiar with some of those things like that. So those are some of the most basic ones that you're going to see and be using when you're working through your software or doing your composition. So let's take a break for just a second, and let's take a look at some of the others. Alright, one of the first things that you'll be looking at, this is an extra staff. That's this right here. And sometimes what this can be used for is, that can be used for a whole lot of different things, but normally your software is going to write lines up above wherever it needs. If you're composing and you go up above, it'll automatically create lines up there for you. So if you have, like, you go here and you decide that you're going to put a note up here, well, it's going to create lines for you automatically, so you don't have to worry about that too much. But this here is to have up above some measure or something like that for an optional run or something like that might be happening in the score. So you'd be looking around and you'd be going, what the heck is that? There's another staff up there. Well, that might be like, well, there's a couple different options, to play that. To play at that part maybe. That's one option. But normally it's just representative. It's normally not some type of harmony to something like this. It's normally an option. You've got, well, this melody line goes here, or it's using those chords, or you can use these chords up here. They're up above on this other staff. And that can be one option. Sometimes it is used to write some type of harmony, optional harmony or something like that, but that's normally the use of that. So let's take a look at a couple other things. All right, the next thing we want to look at is triplets. When you look at triplets and things like that, you have a triplet, and that's going to be one note in this, or three notes in the space of one. The ratio of it, and also you can have like a duplet, and that's going to be two notes in the space of three. You're going to have these other triplets. You're going to have quadruplets. It creates a quadruplet, and the ratio is 4 to 6, 4 notes in the space of 6. Quintuplets are going to be 5 notes in the space of 4. Sextuplets are going to be 6 notes in the space of 4. Septuplets are going to be 7 notes in the space of 4. Octuplets are 8 notes in the space of 12. Nontuplets, 9 notes in the space of 8. And there's other ones that you can create your own different ratios for how many notes in the space of what. So that's, you have to, so that if you have like, you have one bar here, and you want to do, you want to subdivide that, and you can actually do it with dots and quarter notes, with the dots and things like that, and ties, and build it. But a lot of times it's easier just to build it from tuplets, quadruplets, quintuplets, and things like that. Sometimes you can't even do it with that. You have to do it with that to actually create that. And so that's something that you want to familiarize yourself with. So what would be the next thing we want to look at? All right, the other thing we kind of want to look at, the clefs. We had talked about the clefs, and I think we went through this fairly well. And most of these are fairly self-explanatory. You have the treble clef that's based around the G, the bass clef that's based around the F, the alto clef here that's based around what note is that? That's going to be the B, correct? And that's going to be the D, the tenor clef. And then you're going to have a percussion clef that's made for any type of percussion instrument or drums and things like that. There's another different type of percussion clef there. You have tab for like tab 6-string for guitar, tab for 4-string like for the bass, things like that. Treble down, so that's going to be, it's going to be down 1 octave or up 1 octave, treble up 1 octave, bass down 1 octave. Sometimes it'll be have different BA or VA and things like that, to where it's treble up like 15, which is going to be 2 octaves. 2 octaves up or down 2 octaves and things like that. And so you have, those are the basic ones you need to look at. There's like there's a sub bass here that's rooted around this tone on the bass clef, and there's a baritone bass that's rooted around this tone on the bass clef, and on this tone on the bass clef. And there's other ones that are like that are these are archaic, so I wouldn't worry too much about those. But those are the basic ones that we've already talked about. We've already talked about the key signatures that we have to deal with. We've talked about the time signatures, bar lines, that we've talked about that for the most part. That, you have like a final here, that's pretty obvious to see that that's going to be final. This is going to be normal between measures. This is going to be a repeat. So if you see this and one on either side of it, it's going to tell you to repeat those measures. Like if you had one here and one here, it would be trying to tell you that when you get to the end, repeat it again. Does that make sense? And so those are pretty basic concepts. Some of the other ones we're not going to really get into. Let's take a look at some of these. There is a lot of these, and let's just take a look at some of these, because some of these, it can really be depending on how it's used and what kind of context you're using on it. So let's take a second and let's take a quick look at these other notations. Alright, real quick, these are pretty simple. Trill is basically kind of like a tremolo. It's normally trying to tell you to go between 2 notes. You'd see 2 notes right next to each other, and it'd be trying to tell you to trill those back and forth really fast between those. That's a pretty simple concept. Slur normally is when you're dealing with a slur that most of the time it's going to be like legato, and that's going to be like they're going to be flowing and smooth. There are going to be like no separation, that they just kind of flow along. So you might see that over a bunch of notes. That's just kind of a nice flow and a legato kind of feel. On the guitar, sometimes that'll mean you pick the first note and then you do hammer-ons and just and roll with it, or up or down or something like that. And it's just kind of a smooth flowing, and there's like no separation of them. Crescendo and decrescendo means gradually raise the volume, the dynamics, and this is gradually decrease the volumes and dynamics. Glissando can be, there can be a lot of different ways to see that also, but most of the time it means a continuous slide from one note to the next and just kind of sliding along on those notes, which can be hard on some instruments. On the guitar or the bass or something like that, it's pretty easy. On the piano, it can be a little more difficult. Retard and accel means to slow down or speed up. Is here is first ending, so if you might see that this end of a piece of music, and it's going to show you the first ending, and then want you to go back and come to the second ending and something like that. And that's a pretty easy concept to understand. Things like this we've talked about, 8 VA and 8 VB, playing it 1 octave up or 1 octave down, or 15 MA or 15 MB, 2 octaves up or 2 octaves down. The pedal thing, if you're using pedals on your keyboard, to understand this, you want to kind of look at that and read a little bit about that to get familiar with that. Using the pedal, not using the pedal, in different ways you can use the pedals. Some of them have 3 or 4 pedals on them, and it really depends on how you're using them. So you kind of want to look at whatever type of piano you're using and what kind of pedals that you have available on it. All right, and then basically the rest of them, vibrato is really easy to understand, and that's almost like a tremolo, but like a whammy bar on a guitar, that type of thing. And it's trying to tell you to do vibrato. It might have one note, and it might be trying to tell you to use vibrato on it and want you to go up and down. Sometimes it's just down and up from that note. Sometimes it's up and down from that note, and you kind of got to watch that. That can be the same thing with trills and things like that. Depending on how it's notated, it wants you to go to the next note, up and back and down. Depending on, it can be half step or a whole step or a quarter step for vibrato or something like that. You really got to kind of pay attention to that to see what exactly that's meaning. The rest of these things, we're probably not going to talk about too much, because we don't really need to get into that too much right now. We want to get the basics. As you get more familiar with the basics, that the other things will be much easier to understand. So let's take a look at these again and kind of review. All right, we had already talked about these, what the segno is and what the coda is in those other videos that were talking about the basics of music theory and notation. So we already talked about those. All these other ones like caesura that are pause, mordents, and inverted mordents, you basically, you're going to want to look through those and study those when they're needed. Some of those things you maybe use a lot, like a mordent or something like that. It's going to want you to go, up to the next half step and then back down, and going back and forth, or inverted, going down a half step or down a whole step and back to the other note, things like that. They can be kind of instrument specific also. Sometimes I've got tons of them here that are just, for me to go through all of them, I've got a lot. And there's and they're all very significant, but a whole lot of them can be very instrument specific. So you really want to be able to know what instrument you're working with, unless you're really getting into composition, and which means you're going to want to go through the composition software one at a time, looking at different types of accidentals. Is an example, like this right here. You run into this. What the heck is that? A natural flat. What does that mean? Some of those things, you're going to want to spend some time on it. And I'm not really going to get into those too much, because most of the basic ones we've already talked about. So I'm not going to worry about that too much, because most of them we've already talked about in the other video. And any of the very specific ones for other instruments will kind of come along as you kind of work through it. So let's take a little break and take a look at what other things we have to work with. All right, so the other things we're looking at is, you can run into things like different types of, we're talking about different types of dynamics, and we've already talked about that. when we were talking about things like, hitting it hard or soft or hard, and things like that. We've already gone through that, and it can get kind of complex. The more you get in it, the more you can understand about it. But we've talked about all the dynamics of that. We've talked about beats per minute and what that means, and so most of that stuff that we've covered pretty well. You might have like creating lyric lines that are going to be set in time. Those you're going to have to familiarize yourself with, and sometimes that can be easy and sometimes that can be difficult. Trying to figure out exactly what note you're singing and notating it correctly, and that takes time working with your instrument. And most software you have it's very simple, that you basically want to notate it and put the words to it, and that you have to kind of work through what exactly you're doing there, because you can be doing the voice is very, can be, how do you say that? I mean, it can do a lot of different things, and it can do a lot of different articulations, and you trying to figure out exactly what that articulation is and what you're doing is probably one of the things we've already talked about anyway. Chord symbols, putting chord symbols on your staff, to where when you have a chord or something, you notate it. So it's really easy for whoever's reading it to, kind of follow along, what chords you're playing. And some classical and some musics won't have any chord symbols at all. They'll call it like a cheat sheet, or something like that, with the chord symbols on there. But, basically it's very helpful if you can, without making your score look too, cluttered. So you kind of got to watch out that. Guitar scale diagrams, things like that for guitars and other instruments may be part of your software. Other things that you'd be looking at on here is, there's not much else that I really want to address right at this moment. There is, let's see. No, most other things that I'm dealing with here on the software, there are some things that we covered the basics for the most part, and we'd already talked about most of them anyway. We understand the staff, we understand the different types of staff, the different types of clefs, the key signatures, the timing signature, the beats per minute. We understand those basics, so that when we're going through and looking at the staff, we've looked at basically all the basic things that are happening on there and the basic tools to use. So that when you're going to use the staff, if you're looking on here, you should be able to understand any of that, any of that, any of that, any of that, any of that. Well, I mean, some of these you might not be familiar with, instrument specific. And most of that, I mean, you should be able to, these natural sharps and things like that. Anything that's not real normal, I try to steer clear of unless I really need it for some reason, and there's some real reason for it to be there. That I deal with the same way I deal with music. That if it has to get, complicated, I'll let it get complicated. If I can keep it not getting complicated, I keep it from getting complicated as best I can, so that it's clean, so that the concepts are very easily constructed from the very simple concepts that are the basic foundational blocks of music. And the same thing when I'm notating. Unless something really has to be notated, and I still do to this day, I'll be writing along or singing something, and I'll go, what is that? What exactly am I doing there? And I have to make scribbly lines on my notation. What is that? And then I have to make a note about it, off to the side or above it, exactly I was trying to do, because there's really no notation mark that really, that really describes what I was trying to do well. It's just like when we talked about using keys and a basic scale, that they're the basic components to work with. Sometimes you got to mix and match things, and sometimes you might have to come up with something else, to figure out how to notate something you're doing. Most of the time, you shouldn't have to worry about it too much, if you're staying pretty much, unless you're getting into some very strange articulations or voicings and things like that with the instrument you're working on. So I think we've covered most of it, as far as I know, the basics anyway. That way that, whenever you're looking at, a score, that you should be able to look at a score, and for the most part, that if it's, even something like, something like an example score like a concert band, and you open it up, you should be able to look at any of these things on here and be able to understand what's happening there. You've got these brackets that are trying to contain most of the time the same type of instruments, like wind instruments or brass instruments, and most things like that, or things that are working and doing specific types of harmonies together. Those kind of things can be what that's used for. And the names of the instruments, talking about what kind of clef that we're talking about, the key signature, the time signature. You're looking up here, this 8VA, and we talked about that what that's doing with the octaves, if it's going up or down or stuff like that. You're talking about the beats per minute. It's 12/8, so this, it's trying to tell you how this note's going to have 144 of that note in a minute. And they've also put the Italian, voicing of what that is, which, is there. It's not really possible. It's not normal that, the whole, as they get better, they do. But, if it's, a set time, it's really hard to just say what it is, like that, without having the beats per minute there to have it fairly exact. And all the other stuff we talked about. We talked about the notes, the scales, the rests. We've talked about all the ways, articulation, staccatos, and accents, like you see here. Appoggiaturas, you see one sitting right there. And we've talked about most of these concepts. You're looking here, these are slurs on these, that are timed together, that they're nice and flowing and things like that. You got to be real careful and make sure that's not a tie, that it is a slur. It's really easy. If it's two different notes, two different tones, it almost certainly is some type of slur. And where if it's the same note, and it could be a tie because it's trying to extend the value of it. But I would say that now that from what we've talked about, you should be able to go through any score like this and have a good understanding what you're looking at. This right here, you can look at this right here, and you get that notation software I talked about, that musician, and it'll have you practicing a lot of your timing. And it comes out looking, when they're having you practice the timing, a lot like percussion notation. And you get really familiar with percussion notation, no matter how much you use it or not, that you will get real familiar with what's happening with it, and familiar with seeing it. Because most people are real familiar with seeing notation here, and when they start looking at, percussion, notation, they're like, what the heck? Because it looks a little different. It's just got a little line here at the bar. It's not that different, but it just looks different. Does that make sense? But just about everything we see on here, we've talked about. You see that trying to raise up in volume there, and you see this mezzo forte. It's a dynamics mark, to tell you how hard to play it, how loud to play it. And there's a trill there, or tremolo, and that's there's a rest with a dot on it. And we've gone through just about all these things, and it really comes down to you understanding that and the concepts we've talked about. And you're going to run into other ones. Don't worry. I didn't in this video series so far, prepare you to go off and run the Philharmonic Orchestra. Trust me, if you do, you're going to have some issues. You're going to want to do a little more studying. But, most of the concepts that are that simple, and it's the simple concepts you want to deal with. So when you first start looking at it, as you go along, you download some scores and look to it, and you're all of a sudden starting to come to understanding. You understand what that is, and you understand the notes, and you understand the value and the scales and the key and the time signature, and you understand the accents and the dynamic markings and all the other markings that we're talking about. You may run into some issues with this stuff. These kind of things, when you run into some of these, you may or may not run into some issues with that. And things like turns, inverted turns, caessuras, and things like that. Those things, as you work through them, you want to investigate them a little bit better and get some of those things that can be real specific to how somebody sees how that's supposed to be performed. It's like an articulation. It's like a bass player that likes to slap his bass with his thumb, and he's got a certain way to do it, and he hits it so hard, and he slides off, or I don't, however he does it, and he's there. There's a, it's basically he's looking at it'll be marked as a slap staccato in marking, but that might not be an accurate representation of what's happening there. And so you really got to kind of, those kind of things you want to kind of look at and really spend some time looking at. And the same thing with some of these is that some of these things, when you get into some of the brackets and things like that, that you want to spend some time, looking at that and going through your software and trying to figure out what they're trying to tell you. What are they trying to use it for? Because a lot of them are very self-explanatory, but there's been a lot of times I'll be looking at some kind of score and I'll see some type of marking and I expect they're talking about one thing, but they're not. They've used it for something else. They've got this bracket on there or something, and I'm expecting one thing, and it's like not what they were thinking, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Things like this. Do you want it to come down in silence to silence, and from silence coming up, those are some very simple ones there. But there's lots of them, and the more complicated as you go along, for now, really familiarize yourself with the basics, because as we talk more about advanced theory, we're going to go from here, and we're going to steer away from the compositional software and the notation for a little bit, and we're going to talk about some more advanced theory, because I want to kind of get that out of the way so that, you have an understanding how to voice this on the piano, and you have a good understanding how to figure out how to do that on your instrument, and what the components are that you're dealing with and how you're going to have to learn how to voice that on your instrument, like we learned how to do that on the piano. And you have another medium now to voice your theory, and you now have, not only do you have the theory, but you also now have space and time to work with inside the notation software, because that's those two mediums. Now you have space and time to work in your compositions, and that is so cool. So we are going to probably get right back into some advanced theory and talk about some advanced theory. I suggest you take your notation software, even something like MuseScore, and go through it inside and out. Look at every little piece of notation, everything that's happening, and read about it. Those are the basics you're going to really want to know about. I mean, you can look here on this full score that there's nothing used here that we didn't talk about. There's nothing on this score anywhere that we didn't talk about. We talked about everything that's on this score. And this is a full score. This is a full concert score, and we've talked about everything that's on here. Everything that's on here, we've discussed and we've talked about. There's nothing on there that, once you familiarize yourself with what we've talked about and you get more comfortable with it, that there's nothing there that we haven't covered and spoken of. So, it's going to be more complex things when you really start getting into some more complex compositions and writing your own stuff, and that just takes time. I mean, I don't notate as much, I spend my time doing audio engineering, composing, recording, mixing, and mastering, doing teaching, doing, compositions. So it's not like I sit around all day long composing, and that I'm using all the time. I got this workflow that just goes, I just don't. Sometimes I'll be sitting there going, oh man, what do I do there? What the heck is happening there? Because just look at right here, this is growing up, and it's going up to this, into this coming measure. Did he mean to do that? Or did he not? Did he want that to stop here, and then at this next measure, that's where it starts to die? Or has he got to go into this note right here where that stops, and then that's gonna, I'm figuring that he meant it to go up, and then, climax at this note, and then off he goes. That's what I'm figuring, but I'm not sure that's what he meant. And that those kind of things, you can run into just very simple things like that even that might not just be lined up the way you might think it's lined up, and there might be some reason for that. The guy might have been thinking, had something in his head that, no, that's going to keep rising all the way up to this note. you know, and it's going to keep rising up to this note, and then it's going to climax at this note. I don't know, you know, why. I mean, you know, you have to listen to the whole composition. You might have had some idea. I mean, there's, you know, people get all kinds of ideas in music, you know, and wow, that would be kind of cool. And nowadays there's experimental music where people are doing all kinds of very unique types of, you know, projects, you know, and it's so, you know, you got to kind of really watch that kind of stuff and spend some time really going through it. But you should be able to download a score like this and go through that whole thing and understand everything you're seeing there and be able to tap it out after with some practice and understand what's happening there. The one thing that you're going to come to is trying to understand tunings and, you know, that for different instruments like a B flat clarinet and things like that. You're going to want to investigate that a little bit. I'm not getting into that right now because maybe later we'll get into that a little bit more in depth. But right now, we all wanted to be able to understand the theory we've talked about so far, for the most part, on the notation software and being able to notate it in space and time and the tones that we've talked about and the different theories of putting those tones together in space and time and the basics for doing that. And I think that we've talked about just about all of that. So I think now what we're going to do is we are going to, in the next video, take another quick look at some advanced theory, and we are going to, I think what we're going to do is we're going to really discuss advanced theory so that the concept of advanced theory is very plain to understand. And then I'm not sure where we're going to go from there, but I do believe at this point that you should have a pretty good understanding of theory, the basics of music theory. You should have a pretty good understanding of what's happening when somebody talks about more complex musical theories and where they're going with that, and being able to take the basic components and move forward with what they're talking about. And sometimes it might need a little bit of explanation from the individual that's trying to do something or explain something to you, because he might be trying to weave a tapestry of components of musical theory in a way that you're unfamiliar with. He might be trying to interweave different scales or changing a scale, right, you know, I mean, there's lots of different things that can be done that there isn't an actual written theory for, but it's gotten to the point in music nowadays that sometimes that can be a very huge way to keep yourself flowing and with new ideas and new horizons in music. And so there's a lot of open ground there, and believe me, there are people experimenting with it. And so if somebody's trying to explain something that's going on, or you see something notated, you're not really quite sure what the heck's going on there, well, it might be because they just went off into some, or thought they were going off in some new horizon, or they might have been going off in some new horizon, or you know, or the steps towards that. So that's a very simple concept to get through your head. So I hope you enjoyed the series up to this point, and I certainly hope you enjoyed looking at the staff and what the components of that are. And I hope now that you'll be able to pull out a score like this, and for the most part, be able to walk through it. And as you practice it more and more, you get that musician software and really study it and really start downloading some scores and practicing your notation and practicing your timing and practice all the things we've talked about, and set you up some kind of schedule to get familiar with them, you know, to review and review and review until you're familiar with the concepts we've talked about, that you can pull out a score like this and you can read any line on there and know what's going on. The only thing that I do recommend is if you're getting into stuff like this, you're going to want to understand about different tunings for different instruments, and you know, different tunings for trumpets and things like that. We didn't get into that because we're not going there right now. We may later on in on this channel get into specific instruments and their tunings and things like that. But basically, I just wanted to familiarize you with that. The only difference when you're talking about a different tuning for an instrument, there's no different concept there. It's just that it's tuned a little bit different. One note is going to be set at some note where it would normally not be. I mean, it would be normally C, but it's actually written, you know, starting with a different note because of the way the instrument is constructed, and so that it can work well in the musical structures and with the construction of the instrument. So that's a very simple concept to understand. A very simple concept is look up, the clarinet and B flat clarinet, and just read about it a little bit. You get a really quick understanding of what's happening, and that transposes just about any instrument that they've done that to, so that it's notated a little bit differently because it's a transposed instrument. It's written a little bit differently because of the way the instrument is. And so you just want to read about it a little bit. So that were the next direction I'd tell you to just at least look at that and familiarize yourself with that and the concept of what is happening there, so that you're not confused by it when you look at it on the notation software and you're thinking, well, there's something different about that. What is that? And, it won't take you long, an hour or so to read about it and get yourself familiarized with it. So I hope you enjoyed this series so far, and I hope that you have your notation software out, and I hope you are going back through the theory videos and you're looking at your theory in a whole new way on the notation, in the notation world, and being able to see what's happening there and being able to understand it and to be able to voice your theory on there, because that was the biggest concept, that the theory we were talking about, being able to voice it on this paper. So if we address some concepts you might thought we were, or some people watching it say, well, you didn't address that. I'm like, well, I want you to be able to, this is so that you can voice your theory on what's happening here. Some things we may not have addressed, but I think we addressed most things simply and quickly and concisely. So I hope you enjoyed the series so far. I hope you enjoy working with your notation software, experimenting around with it and exploring around on it, downloading some scores and doing some writing yourself, and experimenting with your timing and your rests and all the things we've talked about to familiarize yourself with it, and are really being able to start looking at the theory we've talked about and writing it out on the staff. And was the point, so that you can visualize the theory that we've talked about on the staff, and then go from there into, bigger and better things. Peace, help, love. Hope you enjoyed the series. See you in the next one.